From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. Today's topic is part of our ongoing discussion on ESG, with a focus today around the social pillar of ESG, and in particular around fair trade practices. Not only do ESG investors care about this topic, but it's becoming a part of an increasing governmental regulations. So joining me today is Kristine Dozier, who leads Deloitte's Global Trade Advisory Practice. Kristine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I look forward to it.
So maybe just to get us started, you could give us some context. So what is the U.S. forced labor ban, and what does it have to do with customs and global trade?
Great. Carrie, pursuant to various U.S. laws, goods produced in any part through the use of forced labor are prohibited entry into the U.S. And there is no de minimis exception. So any part of the good was produced through the use of forced labor, it may not enter. The most recent of these laws is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that passed this last December with regard to the Xinjiang region in China. And pursuant to that law, there's a rebuttable presumption that goods made in whole or in part from that region, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, are made with forced labor and prohibited from being imported into the U.S. unless the importer can provide clear and convincing evidence otherwise. The legislation also created a forced labor task force specifically for enforcement and to provide further regulatory guidance as to what importers will need to do. It's anticipated June 21st, so we'll get a little bit more guidance of what they're looking for. But U.S. Customs and Border Protection, to your question about what this has to do with trade, Customs is charged with actually enforcing the prohibition. And so making sure that it prevents goods produced with forced labor from being imported into the U.S. Primarily, Customs enforces this through what's called a WRO, or withhold release order. So when Customs and Border Protection has information that reasonably indicates the use of forced labor, they issue a WRO, and WROs may be issued on a particular producer, on a combination of a product type and region. For example, cotton from China, or certain gloves from Malaysia, or silica from the Xinjiang region, tomatoes from Mexico, or a few of the examples that we've seen, or a WRO may be issued for an entire region, anything that may be made in that region. So it's been an interesting process to watch with regard to the WROs that have multiplied and the amount of activity that we're seeing from a government enforcement perspective, and specifically from Customs.
I'm sure our listeners are going to be glad to hear that there are these prohibitions around importing goods that use forced labor, but complying with these obligations seem pretty challenging for tax and global trade departments. What are some of the things that they need to think about?
Well, you're absolutely right. And first, brand protection is so important because no company wishes to be connected in any way with forced labor allegations, right? But then it turns more toward risk reduction because, as you say, it is very admittedly challenging to have 100% visibility to your supply chain, your suppliers, suppliers, and so forth through multiple tiers in the supply chain. We refer to it as seed to shirt transparency. So I think companies are recognizing they want to approach this from a risk reduction perspective to avoid supply chain disruption and certainly to avoid any brand degradation for being associated potentially with forced labor allegations.
So what are we seeing companies in the marketplace do to manage this risk?
Companies are really creating corporate management and risk mitigation plans around forced labor. They tend to have a few different components: people, process, technology, the way we think about it. From a people standpoint, understanding the proper governance, who owns this obligation to create a program around forced labor and the prevention of importing goods that might be associated with forced labor. It's really, we're seeing and we're working with companies, it's a cross-functional interest that involves trade and tax, as well as other functions in the organization. And then as well, including training around that so that everyone around the company can understand the rules and the ways that you can go about a risk mitigation program. The process component really splits up into a few different areas. First, a management's response plan for customs inquiries. Customs has a mechanism called a request for information, or CF-28. We've seen those really expand recently around asking questions not only on the subject matter around the value you declare or the classification of your goods, but now they're also issuing these requests for information relative to forced labor programs and controls around that. So that management response plan, knowing who and how you'll respond to customs, becomes very important. Now, the questions that we're seeing asked relate to what you are doing with suppliers. So we're working with companies to create supplier codes of conduct, supplier surveys, to ask questions relative to, there's the International Labor Organization, or ILO indicators of forced labor. We're expecting others to come out from the new Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act when the regs come out. But looking at those factors and making sure that you're interacting with your suppliers, asking those types of questions to do what you can as a responsible importer to mitigate, the risk. And then lastly, we're companies are really layering this onto other CSR, or corporate social responsibility activities. There may be a variety of interactions with suppliers with regard to other interests. And so with many companies, we're finding there's an infrastructure you can leverage as you're trying to build out a plan around forced labor. And then lastly, in great degree to technology perspective, risk assessment. So looking at your data, understanding, whom are we supplying from? What regions are they doing in business in? I'm really analyzing that supplier data, which types of products present the greater risk to us, to just kind of understand that from a risk assessment perspective. Do we have alternatives or not? And kind of thinking about the supply chain from a risk assessment perspective. The last piece, I would say, which is a little less common, admittedly, is a tracing exercise. There are a variety of tools in the marketplace that, through corporate intelligence algorithms, automated intelligence, have the ability to trace to some degree business relationships and allow companies to prove that there is no nexus to a particular region, upstream in their supply chain. And we've seen companies that are operating in industries that may already be subject to a WRO, getting more involved in this type of activity. And we may see more and more of that to come as the enforcement of the most recent forced labor ban increases as well, too. It's really a mix of a whole host of things around people, process, and technology to get your arms around that corporate management and risk mitigation plan.
Well, just given the complexity of supply chains, it sounds like it will take a lot of people, process, and technology to be able to manage that risk. Maybe you could talk about, you mentioned the tax department, but why is the tax department involved in these issues?
In many cases, we find that trade sits within tax. So when trade resides within tax, and trade is the function that receives the questions from Customs and Border Protection, they're very directly pulled in automatically. We're also seeing indications of other reporting obligations that could potentially pull in tax. We're following, there's a House Bill 6270, I believe, that is the Forced Labor Disclosure Act. It's a proposed bill that requires issuers of public securities to have a full understanding of your supply chain and publicly disclose any activities relating to China's Xinjiang region, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, and then as well report gross revenue and net profits attributable to those goods and whether you intend to continue importing that merchandise. So while that is not the law today, we're finding a whole host of ways the government is kind of evaluating how they want to continue to expand enforcement in this area. And while I can't handicap it, the original version of this bill did pass the House with a pretty significant margin. It ultimately was withdrawn and was reintroduced last year. So we're watching that because there may very well be more direct ways that this gets pulled in through different types of enforcement mechanisms.
Got it. Well, thank you. What an interesting discussion and a real opportunity for the tax organization to add value to their broader ESG efforts. So thank you for that discussion.
No, absolutely. And as I said, we're finding that trade departments are really doing a great job of taking lead. of looking to see what questions customs is asking and learning how they can help add incremental value to the company to really prevent against a whole new type of risk. So it's a great topic, and we'll keep following it. And it's one that it's obviously well worth our efforts and clients' efforts to support.
Got it. Well, if our listeners would like additional detail, feel free to reach out to Kristine on LinkedIn. You can also go to Deloitte.com and search on global trade to find some other relevant articles. But that's all for now. We hope you join us next time and continue to be well, everyone. Take care.